Hi everyone. My name is Dr. Sneha Roo. I'm a palliative physician and I'm the founder of Ori Kalankini. Ori Kalankini is an organization that's changing narrative, theatre and dialogue. This series is called Leaning into the Network series, where I'm bringing people from different parts of our network to meet each other. They share their journeys, they share their skills, and they share the specific relief efforts, if any, they're doing around these times. So today we have Aisha Susan Thomas with us. Hi, Aisha.
Hi, hi everyone.
Right. So just letting you know that we are live on Facebook. So, we'll take up questions. So if you have any on the Facebook comments page, right. So Aisha, we ask everyone who comes here same first question that when were you made aware of your gender? Like, when were you told that, oh, yeah,
Um,
go.
as far back as I can remember, to be honest, I grew up very feminine. I have one brother, and my parents were fairly liberal. Fairly liberal. I grew up in Bombay, but it was also very clear what gender roles we were inhabiting. I don't think I owned a pair of trousers until I was maybe 20. I'd always worn skirts and dresses, and that was very much how I grew up. Frocks and very, very feminine upbringing. So at the first time I questioned my gender was never, to be honest. It was just from a very young age, you're a girl.
Wow, yeah, yeah. Um, so you're a theater professional, and let's go to your work. Oh no, before that, what drew you to theater? Why did you choose theater as a medium of expression? What brought you there?
So I used to be a kid who would daydream all the time. Always, my head was somewhere else. And growing up in Bombay, those of you from Bombay, you know about summertime at Prithvi that used to happen. And so my mom used to send us for those workshops. I think the first one was when I was 13, 14. And I remember being in a workshop with Neeraj Kabi. He was doing something with called Frozen Expressions, where we worked with masks and puppets. And in the middle of that workshop, I remember very clearly feeling so present, which I'd never ever felt before. As someone who's so used to drifting off and being in 7 different places at once, theater was the first thing in my life that made me feel like I was in the room. And that's a powerful feeling for me. And that's something that I've always kept chasing. And that's why I do theater even today.
Wow, that's really powerful. In fact, I had very similar experience when I was at. I just did a small theater workshop with
Mm.
Aarti Shakti in Pondicherry.
Okay.
Even the way I found out about it also, like I was googling Adi Shakti to learn about the goddess Adi Shakti, and then this showed up. And when I read their source of performing energy workshop, the schedule, and
Yeah.
I just felt like, okay, this is, I want to understand how body is and how it works. Medicine taught
Yeah.
me one part of it, but internally, while you inhabit the body, how does it feel like? So I enrolled for that, and it was more, I would say more leaning on the spiritual side of experience for me.
Mm. Mm.
Nice to hear from you that you felt something very similar.
Yeah, I can really understand that because for me it was the reverse. It was understanding like always being completely out of it intellectually and mentally, and then suddenly finding that physical situation for the first time in my life, and then sort of trying to analyze backwards what exactly that means for me and why that's appealing for me and how that fits in my life.
Hmm. Can you talk a little about representation of women and other sexual minorities in theater pieces, and also about feminist theater itself? So while you were, engaged in the profession maybe early on, did you find role models? Did you find representations of, or did you find the roles that you wanted to do? You know?
Yeah, I mean, starting out, so as I said, I started doing theater as a child. I did my first play when I was 17, again with Neeraj Kabi in Bombay. And at the time, I wasn't thinking about, I mean, feminism was not something I knew about. It was not a conversation we'd ever had at home. These were not concepts that I'd ever come across before. The first time I encountered that was much later when I was in college. I went to Sophia College for Women. And I think if you ask anybody who really went to that college, it was such a formative experience. For me, at least, it was super formative. And I know many of my classmates will say the same about being in that all-female space. And then we had very feminist nuns as professors, which is very cool. And yeah, and I did English literature, and our final year specialization was in feminist literature and the different aspects of it. So radical feminism, socialist feminism, liberal feminism. So it was this whole new world that I'd never encountered before. And suddenly I was able to look back on my own experiences in the past and in the present and see it from a whole new lens. So that was my first encounter with the word, what it means to be a feminist. And then my own coming to it was sort of instantaneous in that moment. As a theater practitioner, yeah, I make stuff that I'm passionate about, that I'm excited about. I identify very strongly as a feminist. It's been a big part of my life and the decisions that I've made always. So my work does reflect that, but I mean, I like to think it reflects that. And yeah, I think there've been amazing role models. I think we have some wonderful feminist theater practitioners in the country, also internationally, of course. And it's been a process of seeking them out, but they do exist and they make amazing work.
Right. Who are your favorites? Because I'll go look them up after this.
So recently, so Pallavi MD, for example, when she did C Sharp C Blunt in Bombay a couple of years ago. Oh, wow. I mean, it's a phenomenal theater piece just in terms of craft itself. It's phenomenal. And of course, it's deeply feminist. So that's a show that I saw quite recently that I really loved. Yeah, and I keep returning to.
Let's come to the conversation we had. Like you reached out to me and you spoke about the research you were doing about misogyny in medicine. So can you talk about what you found out and for what project it was? So you introduce your work and then you talk about your research.
So there was an article about a year and a half ago that I remember reading on Agents of Ishq. And it was by this doctor, a gynecologist in Bombay, and she was talking about her own education as a medical student and how deeply misogynist it was, and specifically how so much misogyny is codified into the textbooks. And I found that very interesting. It was something again, coming as an arts practitioner, my parents are in the arts industry, so medicine was not something that I had a lot of experience with at the formal level. So that was new information for me. And I remember writing to Agents of Ishq and saying, can you connect me to this doctor? I would love to talk to her some more about this. I just want to know more. It wasn't about, oh, I'm going to make a piece about this or anything. At that space, it was just for my own personal learning. I wanted to learn more about it. And they did connect me to her as Dr. Suchitra Dalvi in Bombay. She runs something called the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership. And they do phenomenal work across Asia in terms of abortion advocacy and feminist healthcare. And that was, again, brand new world for me. And that's when I started reading around the subject. And that's when I found you. And I remember writing to you and saying, okay, so I'm researching this and I'm trying to get as many different perspectives as I can. And specifically in the Indian context about what textbooks do and what they don't do. And because I work in education myself, I'm a drama teacher. That's the field I've been in now for, I don't know, 5 years. Almost. And so I was very curious about that intersection of education and gender and sexuality and how we take myths and stories, which I love, and mythologize them to the extent that they come into our textbooks and suddenly become laws and codes by which we live our lives. And that really interested me. So that was the genesis really of the project. And then of course it turned into its own animal.
Yeah. Can we talk about the amazing flabby-breasted virgin?
Yeah, so the title really comes from textbooks of forensic medicine in India today still define, of course, They look at the intersection of jurisprudence, so the law and medicine, and there's an entire chapter on sexual jurisprudence. And of course, the chapter begins with about 6 pages, differs text to text, but roughly 5 to 6 pages on how to determine female virginity. And I found that really fascinating because, of course, there's no counterpoint to how to determine male virginity. And I'm very curious, and I feel that's deeply neglected. And why must we be so? Why even what we choose to study tells us so much about who we are as a species and as a culture, and how we've evolved. So within that categorization of how you determine female virginity, there are these really handy little tables and that illustrate the differences between floret and defloret women. Again, terminology that I'd never encountered before. That was really fascinating. Floret as in a virgin. I love that women are compared to flowers. That's brand new. And defloret as in women who apparently are not virgins anymore. And one of the differences, apparently, according to the textbook, is that virgins have firm, perky breasts, and defloret women have flabby breasts. And I found that immensely fascinating because I have never in my life come across this distinction. I think my breasts began to sag when I was, I don't know, 15. And I definitely hadn't had sex at that point. So now I was very curious about this strange medical phenomenon that had occurred in my own body. And I wondered whether other women had encountered this and how they understood themselves within the context of these texts. So that contradiction is what the title comes from, The Amazing Flabby-Breasted Virgin. It reminded me a lot of, in the old Victorian freak shows, they would have these circuses, and you look at women with 2 heads and men who are very tall and men who are very, very small. And I said, what we consider normal and what we consider abnormal, and how we then break that categorization, again, as I said, tells us so much about how we understand everything as a culture.
So, you have researched and spoken to many healthcare professionals, and what do they have to say? What is their perspective? Because that's media for us, and that's what we've given. We imbibe it and we practice it throughout our life without even questioning. And what are perspectives you got from the other people you spoke to?
So I got a range of perspectives. I mean, there were some people who were, a lot of the younger medical students I spoke to, some were genuinely confused. They were like, but what do you mean it's not always like that? The concept of what is the relationship between lived experience and textual knowledge, that doesn't seem, that's not a discourse that seems to have trickled down at that point yet. So a lot of students were confused as to, well, what do you mean it's not like that? That is how it is. And there was another set that were outraged and upset and said, oh no, it's crazy, but we have to do it for the exam. And this is like 3 marks and 4 marks and 5 marks. So you have to fill in the table and say, yes, defloret women have skin colored vulvas and floret women have pink vulvas. And I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. I didn't know the colors changed. So it seems small and insignificant, but then suddenly you look at the ripple effect of how that affects both your medical care, but also how we see ourselves. So students, I got mostly those 2 reactions. A lot of the doctors were just, well, that's how the textbook is, and this is also reality, and we see this all the time. And I was like, don't you feel there's a dissonance between your practice, your lived practice, and your textual knowledge? But I think a lot of that education is also taken for granted, and a lot of doctors would respond saying, no, I don't see any dissonance. I feel it is what it is. And I said, well, I've seen vulvas where the outer labia is not larger than the inner labia, even though that's what the medical textbook says it should be. And of course, we've got so many feminist projects about vulvas are different and breasts don't all look the same. And there's a lot of activism that's happening in that space. But why is that activism not happening in the medical community? I mean, surely they see more vulvas than anyone else on average. So, it needs to happen in both spaces.
And that continues to even the queer, what bodies you consider as normal, and what, like, for example, I'm pointing towards the surgeries done on intersex babies. I have seen one professor of mine. I think it's the most horrid experience. Like I want to undo that from my memory. So this was a pediatric surgeon. We had to intern, and I was in my internship period and had 15-day posting in pediatric surgery. Um, I got to assist in a few surgeries, but this one particularly, like we were wrapping up, it was end of the day, and one man came from Bengal with his very young daughter, maybe say 2 years or 3 years maximum. She had her, her labia were just joined together. So they were just separate, and that was causing a lot of problems. Her urine was just dribbling. So that caused problems. And he just poked in a scissor and opened it. And she started crying, and like I was shocked. I was in a shock that this happened. And I wish, I was not there, but I was there. And I didn't know to say that, we should have anesthetized. And I'm sure even if I got the thought then, because I was too frozen to even have a thought. And even if I had a thought, I don't know if I would have opened my mouth and said, because it's very one patriarchal, also hierarchical with respect to age and seniority. He did that. He looked at me, he smiled, and he said, "See, I did it so fast, or else these people had to get